So welcome everyone to the first panel that we have today, and that's a panel on the power and politics of assembly. So I'm just going to give some framing remarks and then introduce our panelists and just tell you a little bit about the format, which is a format we'll follow through the day. So we wanted to start off today's discussions thinking about the significance of assembly, the current trends, and why this whole day matters in ways that sometimes go beyond the legal debates and discussions that we have on assembly. So I think we all could agree that we are living in a protest age, and there have been others, but we're certainly living in one now, whether from the Arab Spring to Black Lives Matter, from Standing Rock to the streets of Khartoum, from campus encampments to coordinated digital mobilizations. Assembly in its many forms has been one of the defining phenomena of the past 15 to 20 years. And yet, precisely as people have gathered on streets, in squares, across online spaces, states have also pushed back harder, faster, and with greater legal sophistication than ever before. New legislation, preemptive bans, surveillance, criminalization of nonviolent protest, the right to assemble, enshrined in virtually every human rights instrument and domestic legislation across the world, is under sustained and deliberate assault. And that's the first reason, in a sense, that we're here today, and we've heard a bit about that. But there's also a second, deeper reason, and it's worth sitting with this before we dive in. When assembly comes under threat, the instinct is to reach for the language of rights, the right to protest, the right to gather, the right to be heard. Rights matter enormously, and we'll hear a great deal about them today in the course of the sessions that we have. But this framing on its own undersells what's actually at stake. Assembly isn't only a right to be protected, it is something more fundamental, a substrate of social and political life itself. People assemble at weddings and at wakes, in town squares and on social media platforms, in protest encampments and in digital networks that span continents. And in assembling, in ways that bring people into genuine co-presence, whether physical or digitally mediated, something happens that the individualized, fragmented forms of expression can't really replicate. Shared presence generates solidarity, identity, collective power. Hannah Arendt called it natality, the capacity of assembled people to begin something genuinely new in the world. That capacity belongs only to people gathered together in whatever form that gathering takes. And that is why the taming of assembly, its choreographing, its managing, its legal containment into forms that authorities find tolerable, is not merely a legal problem, it is a political problem of the first order. What gets tamed is not just a right, what gets tamed is a form of power. And when that power is suppressed, what is lost is not only dissent, it is the very capacity of people to act collectively, to constitute themselves as a political force, to challenge the terms on which they are governed. So this panel, to begin today, asks two questions. One that's urgent and another that's foundational. The first is, what is actually happening right now to assembly and to protest? What are the trends, the threats, and the fault lines? And the second is, what is the deeper significance of assembly, not just as legal entitlement, but as a political form? What is genuinely at stake when it is curtailed, managed, or hollowed out? So these are the questions that have animated serious scholarly attention in recent years, including in the handbook that we've talked about, but it's also what brings us here today. And so with that, I just want to introduce our panelists. We have three exceptional voices to get us going today. First, Gina Romero, who brings the view from the front line and from the highest levels of the international human rights system, so both together. A Colombian human rights lawyer and activist rooted in the struggles of Latin America. She now serves as UN Special Rapporteur on the rights of peaceful assembly and of association. She speaks not just from scholarship, but also the lived reality of defending these rights in some of the most contested political terrains for this in the world, working with activists and movements under pressure from every direction. And I think anyone who's kept a tab on how Gina is doing her work right now with this mandate will have a very strong sense that has continued very much to the highest levels, that she now is trying to influence the way we think about these rights and defend them and expand them. So she'll give us some of the global state of affairs, and certainly it's not a particularly comfortable picture, as we've already heard. Second, very warm welcome to Greg Magarian, who's come over from the US. He's a professor of law at Washington University in St. Louis, and one of the foremost First Amendment scholars in the United States. And he's the author of Managed Speech, the Roberts Court's Stranglehold on the First Amendment. At a moment when American civil liberties are under extraordinary strain, when the constitutional architecture that was supposed to protect dissent is being bent, challenged, and simply ignored, his perspective on what's happening in the US and what it means for democracy couldn't not be more timely. And finally, Illan, who's a lecturer at the University of Glasgow, and he brings a critical legal theorist's eye, working across protests, strikes, revolts, policing, and security. Illan will push us to think harder about what assembly and contentious politics actually mean, and not just what the law says about them, although that is important, what's really at stake when people take to the streets or mobilize, and what the standard framework so often fail to capture. And this is the format for the rest of today. We'll begin, variations will happen, but we'll begin with each panelist giving us a sort of 7-minute intervention to start us off, and then we'll have a discussion amongst the panelists before opening it up to the audience discussion. And we're going to try very stringently to keep to time so that we have enough time to make use of not just the views and expertise in the room, but also to hear some of the pressing questions that people in the room want to hear more from the panel and from others about, to take back to their own work as well. So I'll start by handing over to Gina. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sharath, for the invitation, and to everybody that is here today to talk to us. This is a very important moment for me also, just to try to get a better sense of which are the new, perhaps the nuances and the other issues that I haven't been looking at or are overlooked, or perhaps some new trends that I need to address in the next years of my tenure. I need to start by clarifying that I am not a lawyer. And then that is important, because my background is on politics and international relations. And then when you were mentioning how important it is to see the restrictions of the right of peaceful assembly, especially protest, taking into account that it's not only a legal problem, but also a political problem, it just falls directly in the heart of what I'm trying to do. It's not easy to be a rapporteur when you are not a lawyer, especially surrounded by so many other rapporteurs that are lawyers, but then also surrounded by an environment in which precisely what you were saying, all these restrictions are being addressed as merely legal problems. This is something that goes deeply in what I also try to do, why I choose the topics that I am choosing, and how I am actually dealing with them. So just to start by saying that we are experiencing a closing of civic space that is being generated by the general democratic decline, a rise of authoritarianism, of armed conflicts, invasions, genocides, and the deterioration of multilateralism. And this is something that is important, because that is the context in which we are seeing the restrictions of the right of peaceful assembly, and then this creates the perfect storm that from one side have inspired and justified a bigger movement of protest worldwide, which is something that we are seeing as we speak, but also from the other side, it allows, and in some other cases, even celebrates and justifies the attacks of fundamental freedoms, and of course, the attacks on freedom of assembly And this is profoundly affecting the exercise of these rights. Even in the so-called the more established democracies, which in turn also create more momentum for more protests. So this is like a cycle that we are living in, and then that is creating a lot of pressure also in how different actors see protests, but then how different other actors stand up for protecting the protest. Then again, as it was mentioned perhaps by Michael at the beginning, protests have been the assemblies more affected by these trends. But however, many other types of assemblies have also suffered disruptions, starting with the arbitrary cancellation of right counts by the Zambian government last week, which is one of the most visible and damaging cases of transnational repression I've ever seen. Which is something that needs to be also addressed. But furthermore, we see undue surveillance and even infiltration of all kinds of civil society assemblies over the world. And we don't have yet a cumulative total of the number of restriction of Palestine academic events, not protest. Like single academic events at universities worldwide that have also been disrupted, but this is still significant. And also unions and political parties meetings are prohibited, affecting their organization beforehand, or they face sanctions afterwards. I did a report on elections, and you can see there the different actors, the different associations that have been affected in the context of elections that are not only political parties, not only civil society, but it's a wider list of events. We live in a de facto authorization regime. Although many national provisions, constitutional, legal, and administrative, describe notification regime, I think that it's pretty obvious that we are increasingly having a de facto authorization regime worldwide. And in the more repressive countries, people cannot even see their friends and relatives, which is even harder. We are not talking in these countries about a political debate or a civil society activism that is leading to, for example, I don't know, advocacy. We are talking about people that wants to gather only just to come together and to build these bonds that at the end are the ones that sustain the collective action in the future. I just had a meeting like some weeks ago with a Cuban youth activist, and it was so sad for me to hear how some of them have police cordons, mostly undercover, around their homes to prevent anyone, especially another undesirable activist, for even a short visit. Not even just to bring medicine if they are ill, or just to try to comfort them, because then, at least one of the cases, one of the partners of one of the person who was in the call was in jail. And then they were not allowing people just to go and present sympathy and just to hug and just to sustain also the activists in distress. So you can feel the sadness on broken communications channels and the breakdown of the social fabric that unites us all. Then people will never stop gathering, and this is something that I keep repeating, because we are social animals, and assemblies is and will always be part of our DNA and expression of humanity. Also, in the same way, people will never stop protesting, even in the worst regimes. We see that people keep taking the streets, and then the Iranians can tell us, they can tell a lot about this. Iran, Afghanistan, you name it. But we are undoubtedly seeing an increase in the fear of collective action, especially in context of constant surveillance, stigmatizing narratives against activism, protest, or the defense of human rights, and when collective action is criminalized under pretext of security, counterterrorism, national values, etc., etc. And about protests, well, I don't want to take another 7 minutes talking about protests, but then we have significant restrictions worldwide, the use of propaganda or stigmatizing narratives against protest in general, or against certain groups that protest, Gen Z, indigenous or land defenders, LGBTIQ, women, etc., or against certain agendas for the pro-Palestine, the environmental, or for instance, and this is something that you are not going to like, the far right. We are increasingly having conversations with many people. I don't want to look at you. Yeah. With many people about how important it is that we defend the right to all of us not only to our friends, because at the end that is creating a very deep problematic situation in which some actors feel excluded, and then those actors that are increasingly in power are the ones that then are going to restrict even further the rights. And then I'm just going to leave it at the end with the spread of less restrictive laws and regulations that act all in tandem. So vague laws related to counterterrorism, foreign influence, national security, and other issues, inadequate definitions of anti-Semitism, hate speech, and others, the amendments of criminal codes or general legislation that establishes long list of places of special protection, that at the end, well, increases penalties, but that in some extreme cases just take off all the streets just to protest. The surveillance and the chilling effect that this creates, and I will be presenting a report very soon on this, and the excessive use of force by the police, which in some cases includes acts of torture and ill treatment in the streets, in many cases related to the use of less lethal weapons, and in places of detention, including sexual violence, and in the worst scenario, the killing of protesters. And we have a pile already of protesters, especially young people that have been killed. So that is pretty much the global landscape. It's not very happy, but at the end, I keep saying, and I repeated what I said already, people will still gather and people will still protest. And then that is where at the end, hope lies. So I'll leave it there.
Greg, invite you to take up the hope baton, but you may not wish to.
Oh yeah, this is just going to be a bundle of cheer. Well, I want to thank the overlapping group of conference organizers and Oxford editors for allowing me to participate in this remarkable gathering today. My work on my chapter in the Oxford Handbook was quite an education in comparative law of assembly, and so I greatly appreciate the invitation from the organizers today that I fulfill the stereotype of Americans and talk exclusively and myopically about the United States. And I want to approach the topic of the right of assembly and the state of protest in the United States by following a very rough historical timeline. And following that timeline along two different measures, the social reality of protest in the United States and the development of First Amendment law. And I'll begin somewhat arbitrarily in 1940 because that's the point at which First Amendment law really begins to flourish and become significant in U.S. law. Period between 1940 and about 1960 is one, for various reasons, of political conformity in the United States. It begins, of course, with the U.S. involvement in World War II, and then in the post-war years, there's a sort of social coalescence often enforced as by the notorious McCarthyism, sort of crackdown on political dissent. In any event, for a variety of reasons, during that 20-year period, public protest is relatively muted and not frequent in the United States. During that same period, the Supreme Court is beginning to develop First Amendment law, and the early development of First Amendment law focuses a great deal on the rights of politically and socially marginalized speakers, but there's very little attention by the Supreme Court to questions of assembly and public protest. To the extent the court considers matters of public protest, it actually develops some somewhat restrictive doctrines. For example, excluding from the First Amendment's protection speech that inspires violence on the part of audiences, the doctrines of fighting words and hostile audiences. And toward the end of this period, in 1958, the U.S. court develops the from an international perspective, rather curious doctrine of expressive association that sublimates the constitutional right of assembly and begins to emphasize group formation in a more abstract way. Again, I think reflecting or at least paralleling the relative dearth of public protest. Well, the next period is the 1960s, and in the US, as in much of the rest of the world, the 1960s is a flourishing of protest movements. Initially because of the Black Civil Rights Movement, that continues through the decade. Later because of student-led protests against US involvement in the Vietnam War, and eventually toward the end of this period with the beginning of the flourishing of liberation movements of women, LGBTQ people. So a multifaceted era of robust public protest. And during this period, the court develops First Amendment doctrines that are much more attentive to and friendly to public protest, largely in a series of cases arising from the Black Civil Rights Movement, allowing for greater freedom under the right of expression, typically, for different kinds of protests in different times and places. Again, the legal and cultural, social developments parallel one another. The next period from the early 1970s to about the turn of this century is, again, a period of reduced public protest in the United States. Not completely absent, but much more muted than in the 1960s. As an aside, I noticed as I was thinking this through that this waxing and waning of public protest in the U.S. almost exactly parallels the waxing and waning of big pop music festivals in the U.S. So to the point that assembly is more than protest, in that there's a very simple parallel to that quite interesting and robust form of assembly. During this period, beginning in about 1970, the U.S. Supreme Court takes the development of First Amendment law in a much more conservative direction, a movement that has never stopped, has only accelerated in the years since 1970. The court starts to focus First Amendment law much more on the expressive rights of wealthy and powerful speakers. During this period, there is once again very little attention in First Amendment doctrine and the development of First Amendment doctrine to public protest. Interestingly, there's one significant case in the early 1980s that quite robustly protects rights of advocacy of violence in the course of public protests. But interestingly, that's a case that actually arose from civil rights protests in the late 1960s that just took 15 years to work its way through the courts. So once again, we see the parallel continuing. Public protest becomes a less significant factor socially, culturally, and Supreme Court doctrine follows suit. Protest begins to flourish again in the United States, especially after 2010. There's an initial sort of harbinger, the 1999 Seattle World Trade Organization protest. But interestingly, it is a far-right protest, the Tea Party movement after the election of President Obama, that really ushers in a new era of public protest that ends up coming more from the left, the Black Lives Matter movement, the Occupy movement, and others. But in any event, in the 21st century, especially after 2010, we see a renewed, robust public protest culture in the United States. Here, for the first time, the development of law diverges from social reality. The Supreme Court continues in the direction that it had been moving in since 1970, a direction of more conservative First Amendment doctrine. But now that trend accelerates, and there is no renewed attention to rights of public protest. The current Supreme Court has actually come to a point of rather explicitly protecting almost exclusively the rights of conservative speakers in development of free expression doctrine. So there are a few protest-oriented cases protecting the rights of protesters against COVID mandates, protesters against abortion rights, but those are relatively few and far between and certainly don't address in any meaningful way the broader growth of public protest, again, especially on the left in the United States. I think that divergence is very significant. I can't begin to suggest a cause and effect relationship between social reality and legal development as I am presenting those timelines, but I suspect that there is a sort of symbiosis and mutual sort of cross-pollination between the two timelines. Now that's gone. So we have, for the first time in U.S. history, politics, law, since 1940, a point where public protest is robust and legal protections for public protest are not growing and developing alongside the social reality. That divergence, I think, helps to explain the threats that presently exist to protest and rights of assembly in the United States. I could talk about this for a long time, and I won't because I can't, but very briefly, most of you are probably familiar with the Trump administration's crackdowns on public protests in the United States. You may be less familiar with legislative developments. So at both the federal and state levels, there have been a great many anti-protest measures introduced and in some cases enacted, initiatives ranging from legal protections for motorists who strike protesters who are blocking roadways, to legal liability for people who contribute financially to protests or assemblies that are found by some vague, very inclusive measure to be violent. So there's a wide range of legislative proposals that really threaten the right to public protest with no infrastructure of First Amendment law there to directly discourage them in the first instance, combat them at the back end. It's also worth noting that threats to protest in the US are very much grounded in civil society. There is a great deal of public antipathy, as I think Francesca was talking about, to protest in the United States. Also within the political establishment, the Republican Party is a lost cause. The Democratic Party, for those of you who aren't familiar with it in US politics, imagine the British Labour Party, but even more craven and less responsive to popular sentiment. You get the US Democratic Party. And there's a great deal of hostility on the part of mainstream center-left actors in the United States to public protest as a means of political change. So I'll stop there with that rosy picture.
Thank you. So I guess I'm going to bring the joy. And I want to do that by focusing in on the handbook, because I think it is actually an extraordinary piece of work. I'm delighted to be here talking about it. Having been involved in various different handbooks at various different roles, the way I always think about them is as a sort of incremental addition to the field, to some extent at least, signposting the important figures that are thinking fresh thoughts in the field. But I think this handbook does something different in that I think it actually generates a step change. This isn't an incremental addition to the field. This is a major step forward, and I'd really want to commend the editors in just bringing together a really extraordinary bunch of thinkers and structuring it in such a way that they all have an opportunity to express their different disciplinary approaches, but there's something really, really carefully curated about the way in which they engage with one another and cross over. So it is an extraordinary piece of work, and I think it's only right that we should celebrate it today. There's a ton going on in the book, and I'm not going to talk about it at all. Everything from policing norms and prior restraint and theories of assembly and doctrinal analysis of rights and surveillance and social movement strategy and all. Like I could talk for a very long time, I think, probably, and nobody wants that, me most of all. So what I want to do instead is I want to just focus in on one key move that I think the book makes, which I think is really, really important. And that is this phrase which comes up over and again, that the book is trying to think about assembly in and of itself. And by that, I think the editors and the various different authors who speak about it are signaling that assembly is something which needs to be understood in its own terms and not simply as an iteration of a speech right or an expression right. And this, I think, seems really obvious in a certain way, but actually when we kind of fall back into the jurisprudence at an international level and at a European level, we see over and again that assembly rights are taken as a subset of expression rights. UN norms talk about the expressive protections for assembly. ECHR has really developed jurisprudence on the lex specialis, right? The assembly rights are a special protection. The general rule is expression rights. And so I think the book's attempt to take assembly seriously in its own terms is something which is absolutely essential and something which I think generates this step change. So why might assembly be important in and of itself? And here, I mean, this is just happenstance, but I was reading a second book, my bedtime reading was a book by Sarah Lubrano. It's a lovely light book. It's quite recent. And the book is called Don't Talk About Politics. And the title of the book is slightly confusing because it's not saying that we shouldn't talk about politics. It's saying that we shouldn't talk about politics. that actually, if you want to change people's minds, if you want to change people's behaviors, if you want to reorient people's worldviews, then the key is not to talk to them about it. It's not staging some sort of debate, discussion, a good documentary on the TV or something like that. The point is to get people doing things, to get action, and the way in which we act is actually the way in which we reorient people's views on the world. There's a kind of perfidious imaginary in neoliberalism that we all come to a marketplace of ideas and we just pick off the shelf the ideas which suit us. And I think that kind of focus on expression and discussion, I think is quite problematic. What Lubrana's book does is she says that what structures our beliefs are daily actions, our habits, they are our behaviors, there are friendship groups, our social groups, there are family relations. So there's a really complex and sophisticated account of what is actually going on in shaping people's political views. She says, our actions and experience change our beliefs. And I think this is the case much more than questions of debates or discussions or opinion pieces or anything like that. So why is that important in this context? Well, I think it's important because more than anything else, the act of assembly is an act, right? I think sometimes when human rights looks at it, it sees what assemblies demand or what they say, particularly in the protest space. But actually, the key to understanding assembly is that it is a series of actions. It is a series of processes of organization. It is maybe over time a series of habits emerging. It is a way of structuring particular behaviors. And not just that, but structuring them in a way which leads to people putting their energies into them, right? So people identify with these assemblies. They engage with them. They throw themselves into it. And in that process, that changes how they approach the world. That changes how they think. So in other words, assembly is this immensely powerful tool for getting to the process of changing worldviews and changing ideas. So the promise at the core of expression rights then may be that people will come to a marketplace of ideas, or people will hear discussions or debates and educate themselves and change their way in which they think. No doubt that does happen, but what Lubrano is suggesting is that it doesn't happen half as much as we think it does. And that actually we need to really carefully engage, she says, with social psychology and anthropology and various other things like that, in order to understand actually how that process of changing our minds works. So she says what holds up much better, and I think what I see running throughout this entire book, what holds up much better is the idea of gathering together, of engaging, of throwing energy into a project, into a movement, into something where we act together. So in other words, it's the social practices which go on around forms of assembly. It's the politics of presence, as Tabitha puts it in her chapter. It's the commitment to disruption of everyday life, which takes people and transforms them. So I think this can challenge the established ideas we have, the practices and policies and the ways in which we have of organizing society, and it can do so in a way which is not just about staging something, about performing something as though that were the end of it, but rather is about gathering and building momentum and building movement, and so I think the book is wonderful for opening all of that. The reason I think that is essential is because the way in which the marketplace of ideas works is that it's supposed to give us something like the essence of democracy, right? Like that democracy is a space in which we can all discuss and debate things and then come out with the right answer. But actually, what this book, I think, gives us is an insistence that assembly is actually that access into something like the essence of democracy. Because assembly is where you have that intensity, you have that energy, you have that drive, which changes the way people understand the world and changes the way people act following it. So that's all I'm going to say.
Fantastic.
I feel bad saying this on the public record, Illan, but I do think we really wanted you to be a part of the handbook, and now I see exactly why that's the case. But no, it's really lovely to hear those thoughts about the handbook. But I think the bigger important point is the perspective that all of our panelists bring to the significance of Assembly and its precariousness, which becomes ever more significant because of the wider significance of what Assembly means to social and political and human life. I want to suggest that we just begin a discussion amongst the panelists, and feel free to comment on anything that each other has said. But there are two things going on here. One, I think, Gina, you captured it in terms of a kind of vicious circle. It's a more protest, more enacting and expressing of something that is a sense of dissatisfaction in various ways with states of affairs, and more repression. And Greg, the way that you captured that in the US context in terms of this divergence, it seems that this is a time of rupture in a sense, because this reflects the fact that what brings people together in a polity and what holds it together and makes it sort of something that's ideally consensual but at least tolerated is really at stake here. And so we've got this sort of very dark picture of what's happening right now. And I'm wondering whether you, between you, any perspectives on whether that's a generative thing, in the sense that it's if you see it in the bigger historical picture or arc, it's a generative thing because it actually gives more focus to the importance of Assembly in order to reclaim sort of political and social freedom of different kinds, or are you more? Do you find it more ominous than that? That actually this is much more a worry about how polarized politics and repression start to dominate in ways that are destructive. So, within that, does anyone want to come in? Because that's the first side of this, I think, from the panel today.
I don't know. I just want to. I guess it really depends on the context we are talking about. So every time I mention all this, also the need to respect the far right rights to assembly, to protest, it immediately comes the Colombian case. So for those who don't know, in Colombia, especially the last decades, protesting was always related with the people who were like the supporters of the guerrilla, right? Supporters of the far left movements that in that case were related to either being part of the guerrilla or being like convenient supporters of those. When the far right in Colombia, not even the far right, the more conservatives started to protest, I was really happy. And then the explanation is very simple. And it is because these people was actually challenging the mere existence of the right of protest. But then when they started using it, they give the complete sense of it as a right for everybody. So in that case, when it was, and it created many complicated issues, because then this more conservative protest started to establish this narrative of what it is a good protest, right? So a protest that is clean, a protest that is like very well behaved, a protest that doesn't use like problematic language, which is not true, but then they would say this, and that was like very problematic. But then when you put more people in the exercise of the right, you actually create what Illan was saying on this possibility of doing the political presence and the commitment of disruption for everybody. So in the case of the U.S., you have saying something different, because then it's just like a different, it's a different development because of the history and the cultural developments. But I do believe that we are here trying to protect the right as a right, but what it is behind it, that is like our human connection. And then I keep saying that although my mandates are, of course, rights are individual rights that are exercised collectively, we are talking about the collective action. And talking about the collective action talks about, and then when you go back, talks about revolutions in many different cases, even in revolutions to call for independence in many of different countries. We are talking about, as you were saying, carnivals and many other cultural and sport assemblies and so on. So when you don't defend the right to protest, you actually are not defending the rest of the assemblies. And this is the entry point that I have used in many legal contexts in which bad laws wanted to be adopted to curtail the right to protest. And then this is something that needs to be always there. It's not about a protest. It's about the possibility of being together and acting together. And then that it is, this is, I do believe that this is more, it's bigger than only one specific protest or one specific type of protest or one specific expression, action related to an assembly. I don't know if I replied the question, but it was like the reflection of where is the stress for the debate.
Yeah.
I have to say my head is spinning a little bit from just processing what my co-panelists have been talking about. So I want to try to articulate a couple of thoughts, and I don't know if I'll really be able to at all. One is, I think this I felt at some point like this addressed your original question, and I may have lost the thread. But at one level, I think we shouldn't ever expect established power to be friendly to or comfortable with protest, because the idea of protest is an idea of disruption of established power. And so one way of looking at the story that I told about the US is that there's actually only been one period when the US Supreme Court, as an avatar of law and elite power, has been in harmony with public protests, and that was the 1960s. In the other periods where I said there was a sort of parallelism, it was periods where protest was receding. So in some ways, I think the idea that established power is pushing back against protest is entirely predictable and ominous, because established power could win at any given time, and that presents a huge problem for democracy and democratic values. The other thought takes off a little bit from what Illan was talking about. I think a lot about this relationship between assembly and expression, and I'm of two minds about it. When I hear people start to talk about the marketplace of ideas, I often tend to articulate something like the critique you were talking about, and then when I hear the critique you're talking about, I tend to sort of push back with values of expression, and that may just make me wishy-washy, but I think what I'm trying to get to in some way is the idea that there is a really important symbiosis between ideas and assemblies. And protests really manifest that importance. But I do think that what protest is about matters. There's a definite legal sense in which protections for rights have to be inclusive. But it's also not lost on me that we in the United States have recently experienced an incredibly robust and impressive act of right-wing protest, and that was the January 6th attack on the US Capitol. Which could be called many things, but one of the things that was is a protest. And that's an instance where certainly the people who were participating in that protest, I don't think would have recognized the relationship of their actions on that day to things like Black Lives Matter and Occupy protests. I think it is very well worth pushing for a world where we articulate the value of protest and the right of assembly in a way that people can see that value across political divides. But I think it's also important to think about what kind of world we would live in if different kinds of protesters got their way, and what kind of world we would live in, particularly as it relates to rights of assembly and protest.
So just on your question initially, the way I think about it is there's a dialectic that goes on a pretty constant process between process of protest and process of repression, and that dialectic, I think we have to be careful not to have a kind of static dialectic where it just goes a type of protest emerges like anti-globalization and that particular type of kind of lateral horizontal type of movement, and then the police respond with a whole series of decapitation strategies and so whatever. Like, it's really important we don't see that as a static thing. The protest movement developed new strategies, the police developed new strategies in order to deal with them. But the point is that nothing gets lost in that process, particularly on the side of the police, right? Each new model of protest policing builds on the previous ones. The police continue to train in escalated force strategies from the 70s and 80s. So nothing gets lost. And actually what the police are doing at each point is like picking and choosing from each of the different generations of protest strategies. So actually what we're seeing is a kind of the collection of, using Charles Tilley's idea of repertoires of protest, repertoires of dissension, but also repertoires of policing. And I think thinking about it in those ways is really important. Protesters are not as good at building repertoires because of the way in which protest tends to move in generations. We tend to often lose, things which were very, very common 20, 30 years ago. The new generation of protesters don't see them. And so I think that's interesting. But so I think thinking about it in a kind of dynamic way, ultimately, the danger there is that we move increasingly towards full-out repression, and where that happens, you often tend to see the collapse of civility, right? And I think that's you get these kind of visceral protests, which because there is no space of civility for that protest to happen in a peaceful, calm, restrained manner, instead, erupts in often abject violence, and so I think that's the first thing to say. Just on January 6th and Occupy, I guess I'd push back a little bit on that, because I think actually January 6th looks really familiar in some ways. It's an Occupy movement, right? It's like, let's occupy Capitol Hill. And so I think they may not have been thinking, hey, we're the same as Occupy 10, 20 years ago, whatever it was, but like they're still relying on the same repertoire of contention, even if they maybe don't rely on it. And just, do you want me to answer on the far right point? And
if you want.
Well, so we have a conversation.
Sorry for putting it.
Yeah, maybe I should just not say anything about it, and everybody will think I'm part of the far right. So we have so in Ireland, in the last few years, we set up with the Irish Council for Civil Liberties, we set up the Irish Network of Legal Observers. Gina's on the steering committee and has been really amazing in helping us do that. We have trained bunches of people who go out and do legal observing work. But one of the kind of founding principles of the network is that we don't attend protests where they threaten the rights of others. And that's very specifically designed, and I hope the camera's off, that's very specifically designed because of the very recent history in Ireland where we had protests outside IPAS centres, so refugee accommodation centres, where protesters sought to burn the refugees out, threatened and fought with refugees as they passed over the threshold, and also the recent history of the Dublin riots, again around issues of refugee status. And so because of both security reasons and also because of this kind of fundamental commitment around not lending support to protest movements which are fundamentally hostile to the rights of others, we have refused to send legal observers. We haven't refused because they've never asked us to send legal observers, but we haven't sent legal observers to those situations. And I think there's a really important discussion to be had. Maybe it's a discussion specific to legal observation, but about the extent to which you send people to uphold the right to protest of protesters who are looking to, like in this instance, burn people out, kill people, beat them up. We also have a similar one around, there was a series of protests against trans rights in Cork a number of years ago. And again, I think that's one of the lines that we would draw quite carefully and would refuse to send people to.
In my defense, just a small thing.
I don't think there's a defense needed, but yeah.
My comment is that I keep struggling with this idea of proving that the police don't respect the content neutrality principle.
Yeah.
And then I struggle with that because there is no observation in the other protest. Yeah. So at the end, I always I hope that this is not repeated. I kind of sometimes made it up because then I have the sense that the police act differently, but then I don't have the proofs.
Yeah.
So this is why I always tell to all the legal observers and the monitors that we need more information of the other side, otherwise it's going to be impossible for me to prove any other thing. That is my defense.
We have had legal observers in their own private capacity at some of those events, but not.
January 6th replies about.
Exactly.
So this is really interesting. In the state of Wisconsin, where I'm from, and I can't remember the date, but I'm going to say early 2010s, we had a Republican governor elected who tried to crack down on public employee union rights, and a response to that was an occupation by left-wing activists and sympathizers of the Wisconsin state capitol. But I think the differences in modalities of those protests are really important. And there's a risk here. You were talking before about the, falling into sort of civility norms around protest and what's a good protest. And I try to avoid that tendency, but I think you compare these two events, and there's some very differently important things going on. The Wisconsin Capitol occupiers occupied the place and stuck around. They were there for, I think, a couple of weeks. They were organized with how they were going to handle food and sanitary questions. They were, to some extent, trying to communicate with law enforcement about what they were doing, and they had a very clearly articulated political message. And those are all elements that were absent in the January 6th protest. I mean, there was a political agenda, but it was an agenda about pure power, rather than some kind of articulated political goal of like, okay, this is the kind of policy we want to enact. So there are parallels for sure, and you're right, but I think there are also, just that event in particular, that Wisconsin event, I think can catalyze a different kind of analysis of how those events differ.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm going to ask our panelists to just have any concluding words, and that might be future-oriented in that way. And I'm just going to throw in one observation. I mean, I think Tabitha was a bit too generous when she said that we managed to pull off a panel that was about contemporary trends and the deeper significance of assembly. I mean, I like to think that's true, but I'm not sure that's the case. But the thing that really strikes me about a lot of the discussion today is that the arc of this is about also crises in forms of legitimate government, especially representation. But the arc of it is a sort of disconnect that is occurring between the polity and the people and forms of government and the state, which is under crisis and under threat from various directions, but including from, tech and other forms of power that, are very different, that it has to navigate, and global financial capital, etc. But I think in that sort of arc, really the sorts of champions for rights and for assembly and for associational life and for the forms of sort of civil political life that we would cherish, the sorts of champions we should have that think that they can regain their legitimacy by supporting and protecting this have been some of the first to resile from that and repress. And I think if we don't unlock that problem, which is to give those sources of power and authority that we should be defending and supporting this, the avenue and the direction to see that this is where your source of legitimacy is going to come from, because the more that you ape authoritarian practices or ape the sort of agenda of large financial actors, etc., the less powerful you will be in the long run, the less ability to be, to lead. And this requires us to relate to authority in ways that perhaps we have not been used to, because usually counterpower doesn't have to worry about legitimating authority, and if anything, some of the rights that we defend are a sort of a source of their legitimacy in ways that we find problematic. But it does feel like this is a different juncture. That's my last comment that tries to bring a lot of this together, but I'll leave it to the panel to have the last word or a couple of words.
I just really quickly, I think we're in the middle of an escalation cycle at the moment. We all know it. And in escalation cycles, what happens is one side raises the stakes and then the other side raises the stakes. And I think what is going to be stretched in that is the rights conception around protest, and precisely that issue around what constitutes peaceful protest. Already we see states around the world attempting to shrink that, or trying to police it in various different ways, or say that, well, because there was one violent person, then the whole thing is violent, all of those sorts of things. And I think what we're going to see is, I think there will be increasing levels of violence at protests, both done by protesters and by states, as repression tightens the noose around the neck of forms of assembly. And so I think following some of the critical theory, I think we should all be reading people like Andreas Malm, How to Blow Up a Pipeline. I think that is a really strong signal of the type of movements which are to come in the next decade or two, if this kind of consistent repression escalates further on the state
So
side.
Illan started positive, and that's where he's
Yeah.
Let's see what Gina's
But the
got to
book is
offer.
great. So
Fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I'm usually a very positive person, but then I need to confess that I haven't been able to recover for the cancellation of RICONs. I think that we haven't been able to assess what does it mean for the future of many other assemblies, and when we haven't been able also to figure out what to do in those specific cases. I am really frustrated. Not to brag, but I was one of the ones that were first out, just condemning the whole issue. And then I'm really sad to see that no many countries went out, and not even the High Commissioner says something publicly about this. And then I think that this is a whole new level. It's like when you were playing games that then you unlock the higher level. Now we are trying to enter that. I'm really worried, because I really don't know what that could bring to all of us. Because then it is kind of easy to understand why protests are restricted. But then this, what happened with RICONs, is just a whole new problem that we don't know yet where it goes, and then how are we going to be protecting our possibility to assemble. So not very positive this time, sorry about that.
Yeah, no, thank you. Great.
I was struck by the juxtaposition of the point about terrorism and the point about peaceful assembly. And it sort of got me thinking, for all this talk about what law enforcement is doing, I think the most dangerous threat to political protest in the US, and from what I know in the UK, is about normative framing that empowers law enforcement but also just changes the public conversation. So if you are speaking out in any way in favor of Palestinian self-determination or the humanity of Palestinians, there is a discourse that says you are a terrorist or sympathetic with terrorists. As such, you are violent. As such, you are not peaceful. And as such, you are therefore subject to legal repression. And the difficulty, I think, is that we have normative conceptions that we need to preserve. Peaceful assembly, the concept of terrorism may be vacuous, but the concept of peace is not. So peaceful assembly is a norm that we who care about protest and assembly want to preserve. But I think at the same time, we have to be conscious of the ways in which this level of the discourse has been weaponized, and we need to push back against normative framings that discredit, delegitimate protest, and allow law enforcement and government to have a free hand in repressing them.
Well, this has been a really rich, wide-ranging, impassioned, but I think a brilliant start to the day's discussions. So I want you to all join me in thanking our panelists.